Lacey, and welcome to The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. Today we are talking about the dire situation facing Louisiana as budget shortfalls jeopardize the state's public defense system. We're joined by State Representative Gary M. Carter Jr., New Orleans Chief Public Defender DARWIN Bunton, Deputy Chief for the East Baton Rouge Public Defense Office, Lindsay, and wrongfully convicted activist Robert Jones, who was incarcerated for 23 years for a crime he did not commit, and now is the Director of Community Outreach at the Orleans Public Defender's Office. So thank you all for being here today. And let's just start with a little bit of context. Due to an extreme budget crisis, Louisiana is currently at risk of losing public defense altogether, which would leave thousands jailed without attorneys, court stalled, evidence lost, and denials of justice for victims as well as the accused, all while costing taxpayers a fortune. Now, the Supreme Court has found that every person accused of a crime has the right to a lawyer under the Sixth Amendment. States have different ways of trying to meet that requirement. Louisiana is the only state in the nation that relies on a funding system called user pay to fund public defense. This system, which accounts for nearly 60% of Louisiana public defense funding, forces the very people unable to afford lawyers to pay for public defense through the fines and fees that come from their arrest, conviction, and incarceration. About 85% of people in Louisiana accused of felonies or misdemeanors are poor, so they can't afford whatever fees the court imposes anyway. And because police determine who gets arrested by prioritizing certain crimes, police tactical changes may result in more cases for public defenders, but with less funding. Now, during the pandemic, traffic enforcement has plummeted, resulting in a nearly $30 million budgetary shortfall for the public defense system, relative to what it was expecting. And even the amount that it was expecting is still much less than what experts say Louisiana public defenders need for the state to meet its obligation under the Constitution. To do that, the legislature would need to allocate roughly $127 million in annual funding, which is still tens of millions less than what Louisiana district attorneys receive. Now, ultimately, the pandemic has made an unsustainable situation even worse. Public defenders and local allies in Louisiana have launched a campaign called For the Sixth to raise awareness of this funding crisis and to call on the state legislature to fight for the soul of the state. And our guests today are here to talk about how we got here and what needs to be done in order to save public defense in Louisiana, both during the pandemic and after. So let's get started with our discussion. And turning first to you, State Representative Gary M. Carter Jr. Now, Representative Carter, the budget committee that you are a part of recently agreed to allocate $7 million to public defenders, but that number was just a quarter of the $28 million requested to cope with the pandemic. What has been happening in the Louisiana legislature with regards to funding public defenders? And would you support the full $28 million appropriation to meet the needs of the pandemic?
Good afternoon, Summer. Thank you so much for leading this conversation with these thought leaders on such an important issue. COVID has certainly put a lot of stresses on the state of Louisiana and our nation, for that matter, and it has put especially intense pressure on our budgets. And looking at our budget situation, it has exposed a real problem here with how we fund our public defenders. And it was a problem, as you alluded to in your remarks, before the COVID pandemic even struck. We've had a problem with how we fund our public defenders. And let me go even higher than that. We had a problem with our criminal institutional system here in the state of Louisiana for quite some time. And so with the COVID pandemic, there was essentially a shutdown of traffic tickets and traffic ticket enforcement here in the state of Louisiana. And unfortunately, Louisiana is the only state in the union where we fund, for the most part, our public defender system, public defenders through this user-pay system, or rely heavily upon it. So that meant when those fines and those traffic tickets went away, we were exposed with this $28 million budget shortfall. And the problem we have in the state of Louisiana is we have to have a balanced budget. So for us to be able to fund the public defenders, we have to do so at the risk of underfunding education, which is one of the critical ways that we use to fight crime, or underfunding Department of Health, which is one of the things that we really shouldn't do when we're in the middle of a health pandemic. So we were glad we were able to step up in a bipartisan manner, all together on appropriations side, and do an emergency $7 million. I think it was $7.35 million, if I'm not mistaken, every penny count, to send to the public defenders immediately. And we also have the expectation of going back for another special session this fall, this winter, to hopefully do the remaining amount of the 28. And I expect that 28 million, that figure would grow. But more importantly, we have a holistic problem. We have to fix fundamentally the way we structure our criminal institutional system. Not only does Louisiana, we for a very long time led the nation in an incarceration rate, we lead the nation in an exoneration rate. We lead the nation in convicting the wrong person for these crimes. That is a horrific problem. And it begins with making certain that our public defenders are there to fight for us at the to provide adequate representation at the immediate onset of an investigation. It's critically important, which is why it's embedded in our Constitution, the US Constitution. And so I don't want to talk too much about, get down in the weeds of the budget, but the state of Louisiana, we can't mint money. We have to have a balanced budget. And I'm glad we were able to find the $7 million in emergency money funding, but we must do more.
Thank you, Representative Carter. And it does sound like the 28 million is the goal, and it's something that you're working towards. So you mentioned Louisiana leading the nation in wrongful convictions. And that leads me to my next question. And how have the pandemic and the ongoing crisis of police-involved killings of Black Americans like George Floyd and so many others impacted conversations you're having about providing full funding for public defense so that people are getting the justice that they deserve and that we are not seeing this continued influx of wrongful convictions in your state?
That's a very big question I ask and try to squeeze it into a very short answer, but there has to be trust in our criminal justice system. We have to have, when we have that many wrongfully convicted individuals, it leads to questions of trust. It leads to questions of just whether or not our justice system is doing what it's supposed to do. We have to adequately fund it. We have to make sure that the community can rely upon a stable police force. For instance, one of the things that we're looking at in a holistic sort of way is, as a result of the George Floyd tragic murder and the protest afterwards and the awakening across this nation, is we formed a police task force. How do we go about bettering our policing? How do we go about looking at some of the criminal justice reforms that still are left to be fully incorporated? One of the things that I heard that was very interesting is how can we deploy like non-armed guards, like non-armed police to respond to some non-emergent situation. Every emergency call doesn't necessarily require the police. Is there some other action groups we can send out? Is there mental health treatment that we can send out? If there are de-escalation measures that can be sent out immediately, that one can help solve a problem in a way that is a better use of our resources, but two, it starts to enable more trust in the community. If you have that reputation for for being a world leader in convicting the wrong people, and we're going to be asked to trust the district attorney, to trust the criminal justice system, to trust that someone is going to have their right to a fair trial, that certainly questions it. So it begins with properly funding our public defender system, but it begins even much larger than that, which is how do we fix our criminal institutional system, period.
Thank you, Representative Carter. And I mean, that trust, it just runs, it runs downhill, and it's really what is needed in order to achieve true justice. Yeah. So turning next to you, DARWIN, you run Orleans Public Defender's Office. What is it like to operate a public defender office in normal times of endemic underfunding, let alone on this kind of budgetary shortfall? What kinds of difficult decisions does that funding shortfall force you into? And what is the impact on the people your office represents and on your attorneys and your staff?
Well, those are all very, very difficult questions, all of which we had to deal with. And thank you for having this forum for us to talk about this, to shed some light to some of the folks who may be looking on what is going on in Louisiana and what is happening in public defense in a lot of places. So what we had to do in our office because of the shortfalls is something that unfortunately we're not a stranger to doing. We had to look at our revenues, our expenditures, and had to figure out where we could cut, where we had to cut, because we knew things were going to change in the pandemic. So we had to reduce expenses for things like expert funding. We had to get rid of travel expenses and training. And we had to terminate contracts for conflict representation, because what we have in our office is a system of conflict representation where we contract with private attorneys to handle the cases we ethically can't handle as an office as a whole. And we had to terminate those. And on top of all that, we had to furlough our office so that we could save funding, so that we could, make ends meet. To Representative Carter's point, we can't print money. So we have to live within our means. And the impacts on that were dire for many of our clients. So for clients who were out of custody, we simply weren't assigning them lawyers, particularly where there were conflicts. We couldn't assign conflict cases. And for some of the folks in custody, we didn't have funding for conflict representation either. And that meant hundreds of cases were sitting on the vine without a lawyer working on them. And so the potential consequences are pretty severe. You lose track of witnesses, you lose track of evidence goes stale. Things like digital recordings get erased or destroyed while they're waiting for their lawyer to be assigned to their case. So the consequences for our clients and our community are huge, and it's all based in this dependence on a user pay criminal legal system that is inadequate, unreliable, and inequitable.
Oh, thank you, Darwin. And as a former public defender, I completely understand how difficult it must have been to make those cuts and how dire the situation must be for your clients and for your staff who's trying to make it work and provide justice. So turning to you, Robert, I'd like to bring you into this conversation now. As I stated earlier, you were convicted and you served 23 years for a crime you did not commit. And now you work for a public defender's office.
Yes.
How have your perceptions on public defense changed from before you worked at the office until now? And what led you to advocate to end user pay and instead push to fully fund public defense?
Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for having this important conversation as it relates to the user pay system. I had a perception that, just like many other folks share around the country, that public defenders are sellouts. They're bad attorneys to that extent, right? But when I got out and when I went to work for the office, I seen, and I promise you, I worked with some very dedicated and loyal colleagues who fight for folks' rights. And when I seen that the problem was funding and under-resourced and those things. And then when I start to understand the user pay system even more, I'm like, wow, we have to change this. And right now is a critical time. User pay system was bad in the past, but now in the pandemic, because of the fact that so many people is going to be unemployed over the period of years, that means that if folks get in trouble or they get arrested, they're going to need a public defender because they can't afford an attorney, right? So moving forward, And considering the pandemic, the user pay system is going to really be in shambles. So we have a serious problem on our hand that definitely need to be fixed.
Thank you. And I'm sure that you can relate to, and I'm sure you feel for all the people who are going through the system right now, who are dealing with the extreme effects of the pandemic in light of the user pay model that everyone's working in.
Yes.
So turning next to you, Lindsay, just given your experience, can you explain for our audience what makes counsel, and in particular, public defenders, so important for criminal cases, and what makes Louisiana different from how other places handle public defense? And we'd love to know too, in your opinion, what the right model is.
Certainly. So thank you again, Summer, for having us. This is an incredibly important conversation to be having at an incredibly critical time for Louisiana. So Louisiana, like my colleagues have said, funds itself primarily off of the backs of the individuals who come into this system. We are, as a system, funded primarily through those conviction and user fees. And with this shutdown, with so many people having lost their jobs, worrying about how they're simply going to be able to stay in their homes, how they're going to be able to support their families, the fact that the public defender system and the criminal justice system in Louisiana at large are funded off of poor people having to pay hundreds of dollars into the criminal justice system, it's simply not functional. And it's also a breach of the public trust. You are told that because you are an American, because you live in this country, you have a Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial. And that starts with having a lawyer who is armed and capable of representing you, that you deserve that. And so for you to receive a public defender who has hundreds of cases on their shoulders, who lacks an investigator because their office had to lay off support staff in order to keep the lights on last year, you certainly question whether or not you, that person, that American who's coming into the criminal justice system, are truly getting a fair shake simply because you are poor. Other states used to fund their public defender systems this way, and they decided that was a bad bet. We know now that when you fund it off of the backs of those poor people who are coming into the system, you are going to have unsustainable funding. You are going to have people who are worried about showing up to court simply because they cannot afford to pay. Will they go to jail because they can't afford to pay those fines and fees? And it becomes this vicious cycle of people worrying that because they are poor, the criminal justice system will treat them unfairly. And that is where having a healthy and fully funded public defender system is absolutely essential, because they need to know that they are going to get a fair shake. They need to know that there is no difference between their lawyer from the public defender's office and if they were able to go out and hire an attorney themselves. And so states that fully fund their public defender system at the state legislative level, not saying that all states are created equal, but having a sustainable funding model at the state level where every public defender office in every city can know from year to year how much money they are going to receive means that they can plan for growth. They can plan to hire the lawyers they need. They can know they're going to keep the lights on every year. They can know they will be able to keep their investigators on staff to investigate those cases. And so a statewide general fund model would allow us as public defenders to not be running from year to year wondering whether or not we are going to make it. Our office, like DARWIN's, only a few years ago, had to lay off all but 2 of our investigators in order to keep the lights on. We laid off all of our conflict attorneys in order to just simply keep the doors open. And that's just not justice.
Wow. So Lindsay, it sounds like the difference between having a fully state-funded system really does mean, as you explained, the difference between justice and not being able to achieve justice for so many people that you're working with every day. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask, or just pose a few more questions to all of you. So first, a report from the American Bar Association found that Louisiana only spends enough to support 21% of the full-time public defenders that it needs. As we previously discussed, fully funding Louisiana's public defense system in accordance with the Constitution would require $127 million of annual funding. Now, Representative Carter, starting with you, do you support fully funding Louisiana's public defenders in accordance with the Constitution? And what will you do to get us there?
Oh, absolutely. Of course I do, which is one of the reasons why I'm participating in this very important conversation. And one of the things we need is what we have here. Not only a good conversation, but good advocates. When we were faced with that $28 million emergency shortfall during the last special session, Mr. Jones came and he testified passionately before the Appropriations Committee that enabled us to reach a bipartisan short plug $7 million. And that's one of the other things. Obviously, Louisiana is a conservative state. This is something that we need partners across the aisle in a bipartisan manner. I'm looking at the language in front of me associated with our budget bill. This money that we spend on public defenders is, quote, to ensure equal justice for all citizens. All citizens. It doesn't qualify that. It says some citizens, all citizens. Any one of us could be charged with a crime that we didn't be falsely accused of a crime. And that's whether you're rich, that's whether or not you're poor, that's whether or not you're a Democrat, Republican. If you live in the city of New Orleans like I do, or you live in rural Louisiana, you need to make certain that your constitutional rights are protected, that your Sixth Amendment rights are protected, and this money is there. But as it relates to Louisiana's budget, listen, I think we need a holistic fix of our budget, to be honest. We can't fix this without either raising additional revenues or cutting measures in the budget. And looking at our Louisiana budget, I think there needs to be more money for education. I think we need more money for early education. We need more money for workforce development. One of the problems is you look at this user pay system, one of the things it does is it traps people in poverty. We need to figure out ways to, I was on a conference call recently and just dealing with what does Louisiana need? We need a whole bunch of ands. We need money for our public defenders and money for early education and money for Jumpstart, higher ed, teacher pay. It's so many things that we need to focus on, but it starts off by having a balanced approach to a budget. We've had for years vows not to raise taxes that didn't give us the revenues we needed. We have given away various incentives to industries and businesses without being mindful of whether or not we're getting a return for that investment. So we have to look at it in a holistic way. How do we fix our criminal institutional system? And until we fix it, it's hard for me to call it the criminal justice system. It's the criminal institutional system until we come up with an overall system of how do we approach it, how do we fund it, and how do we do what's best for our citizens.
Thank you, Representative Carter. Now, Darwin, Robert, and Lindsay, I would love to know what you all believe that a fully funded public defense office would mean, individually and for the people that you work with. So, Darwin, can you start us off?
Sure. I think going back to what was raised earlier goes back to trust. I think that when you look at the changes we need, and we need a lot of them, a few stand out. One, structurally, we are designed for poor people to support a system that is supposed to be constitutionally guaranteed. If you look at our statute, if you are found guilty or plead guilty, you owe our office $45. If your case is dismissed or you are acquitted, you owe nothing to the public defender's office. That is not lost on community, that it is literally written into law that we are paid to lose. That does not engender trust in any community. It does not make anyone feel safe with their case in your hands. And it takes a lot of work to overcome that through our hard work with our clients to make sure our clients and our community feel trust from the public defender's office. So we've got to look at structural changes that need to happen because structurally it's baked in, this kind of injustice that we're dealing with in our particular public defender system. We also need to make sure that standards are enforced and that there's accountability for how we handle our cases from a public defender standpoint. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you get whatever we feel like giving you. There is a standard, a professional standard for public defense that we need to adhere to, and we need to show that to our community. And we need to look holistically again, because yes, we need more funding, but we also need to shrink our system. Our criminal legal system is huge, burgeoning, and captures too many Black and brown folks in a cycle of incarceration, release, and incarceration and poverty. We need to dig at the roots of that, shrink our system, provide the protections that our communities and our clients deserve and are guaranteed under the Constitution. And then we can start thinking about then we can start measuring whether or not there is justice in our system, because right now we're falling way short in our criminal legal system.
Thank you, Darwin. And Robert, part of Darwin's points really reminded me of what you said earlier. I mean, he spoke about the fact that the user pay system basically has distrust embedded within it. And you said initially you were very distrustful of the public defender system. So what would a fully funded public defender office mean to you and the people that you are helping?
First of all, as Darwin said, I think number one, we have to do an overall on the entire criminal justice system as it relates to number one, they need accountability. Everyone needs accountability. Second, what would a fully funded public defense office would mean is that our office have been geared in the vision that we have is becoming a community-based organization, not just a law office. And it's gearing towards a direction where we getting away from the punitive concept that the criminal legal system have, right? Opposed to trying to just lock everyone up. Whereas there are folks that really need help. And that's a part of my job as being the director of community outreach. We partner with organizations to provide the various services that these folks need and to keep them free, to keep them on the right path. So a fully funded office not only would provide us with the proper resources, but it would allow us to establish that trust in the community, to build a better legal system. But we can't have a fully funded public defender's office and we got a fundamentally flawed criminal justice system. So we have to overhaul all those things, and we have to start putting levels of accountability to the forefront as well.
Thank you, Robert. Lindsay, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, certainly, a fully funded public defender system looks like every single person who needs a public defender having full and free access to their lawyer and to the defense team that works with their lawyer. I have been with my office for the last 10 years, but I can tell you that there are cases where I was working with a client and the way that we actually helped free that person for the criminal justice system didn't have a whole lot to do with me doing any lawyering, but had everything to do with our social worker being able to help that individual and us being able to humanize what they were going through to the district attorney. You know, we as a state know that we are incredibly harsh sentencers. There were reforms put in place at the legislative level back in 2017 to help with some of the harsh probation and parole sentencing issues we had in this state. And the monies that were predicted to be saved from those decarceration efforts were reinvested. But they were largely reinvested still in the Department of Corrections. Why is it that an individual has to be convicted of a felony and sentenced to hard labor in order to receive treatment? What I'd like to see, and what I think would help aid in a fully funded public defender system in this state, is if we were able to invest those funds on the front end. We know what happens when an individual has a felony conviction and then goes out and tries to get a job or goes out and tries to apply for housing. How about we invest those monies in pretrial representation and pretrial assistance, so that way that individual never has to receive a felony conviction that is then going to stay with them for years and hurt any of their progress.
Thank you, Lindsay. So we started off this conversation talking about how dire the situation is in Louisiana. And through this conversation, while we've touched upon what is happening and what needs to change, I am motivated by you all, and I am hopeful. And so I'd love to know, before we close, what is giving you all hope that we will be able to move forward and carve out true pathways for freedom in Louisiana? So Representative Carter, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, listen, I'm just naturally optimistic. I mean, we have to correct the system. We can't accept it for as it is. We must figure out a way to improve it. We must figure out, how do we get a holistic solution to it, all the way around. One of the big concerns is the criminalization of mental health. Imagine if we can fix that on the front end, what kind of relief that would give, not only to our criminal institutional system, but to our public defenders. Imagine if we had less arrest, imagine if we had better resources on the front end. One of the things that we in Louisiana have, and we have a reentry program in Angola prison. It's a great program. While a prisoner's there, they can get a training and get a certificate. They can become a licensed plumber, a master welder. And when they're released, they're often making $24, $25 an hour. Where we're working on, what does it look like if we had those sorts of programs in our high schools, where kids were leaving high school as a welder or with some sort of certification, where they have the opportunity to go earn that sort of living, that they probably would never end up in our criminal institutional system. I think in terms of pure politics, and I guess we all must be aware of pure politics. People run on being tough on crime. Let's be smart about this. Let's be holistic about this. I think COVID has exposed a lot of flaws in our system. COVID has exposed the problem even more so. It put unbelievable stress on our public defender system. The user pay system has been a problem for quite some time, but then when users are unable to pay because of traffic tickets and things of that sort, and the system is now buckling on its knees, it gives us an opportunity to solve it. So looking at the situation that we're in now as a result of the stresses, as a result of this crisis, let's solve it. Let's move forward. Let's deal with it clear-eyed. Let's make some holistic changes, and let's also be very mindful of how tough that is. It's not just let's move $100 million into, or $127 million as a line item, because that will result in $100-something million cut to education or health. How do we fix the whole system that there's balance and there's stability? There's certainty with the budgets, but there's also certainty in terms of the sort of investment that we should be doing as a state of Louisiana to get us out of this criminal institutional problem that we have.
Thank you, Representative Carter. Robert, what's giving you hope?
This is working with representatives like Representative Carter and other grassroots organizations coming around this issue, to see so many people are very interested and trying to do the right thing as it relates to folks being afforded effective counsel is huge. And that's sort of giving me hope and moving forward, because of all the folks is coming together and lining up on the same direction.
Thank you, Robert. And Darwin, moving to you with what's giving you hope, and just going off of what Robert said, what are things that people at home can do to help with this situation?
Well, 22 years ago, I started my legal career in Louisiana in a civil rights lawsuit about the way that we treated our children in juvenile prisons in Louisiana. And I remember driving up to North Louisiana, sitting on a concrete floor with a teenage boy, me business casual, and he naked in an observation cell because they deemed it too dangerous to give him clothes. He was covered in dried blood and healing wounds from harming himself. And I remember thinking, how did we get here? And we started that lawsuit with over 2,000 kids in juvenile prison. When we ended that lawsuit, there were fewer than 400. what gives me hope is I've seen it done. I've seen the people of Louisiana, I've seen decision makers in Louisiana be confronted by the brutal facts, like that boy on that concrete floor who's naked in an observation cell, and come together to find solutions that matter and work. I have what they call distance in my eyes. I know what the bad days look like, and I know we've come a long way and there's still a long way to go. I've seen progress, and that gives me hope. And I work in an organization full of brilliant, young, committed, absolutely fierce advocates like Robert, like the lawyers we have on our staff, like our investigators, and we keep moving. Our vision is dignity, justice, hope, and we work every day to fulfill our responsibility to protect innocence, fight for our clients, and hold power accountable. So I think for me, the hope it comes from that energy, that perspective I have, along with my colleagues. And I think if we just keep that in mind, keep tapping into that reservoir of good, of goodwill, of smarts, and just keep grinding like we have been doing, that we're going to make even bigger and better changes. We're going to get rid of user pay. We're going to root out the racism and the problems we have at the root of our criminal legal system. It will take time like everything else, but because I've seen it done, I remain hopeful.
Thank you, Darwin. Now, Lindsay, please bring us home with what is bringing you hope.
What's bringing me hope is that at the beginning of this pandemic, I believed that we were going to lose thousands of lives in our jails because we weren't going to be able to get in there and save our clients. But I can tell you that I'll just speak for Baton Rouge, and being able to get over 1,000 people out of our jail before COVID hit our jail, watching those passionate and talented public defenders in our office and our defense teams go in and save lives in the last 5 months, to get the phone calls from moms and dads and children saying thank you for getting my mom or getting my dad or my son back to me. That's what gives me hope. We do this work because we love working with people. We do this work because we love being a part of the communities that we are in. And so what gives me hope is that we've been able to see how incredibly powerful we are as a public defender system when we work together, we work with one another, and we work hand in hand with those other stakeholders. So I'm incredibly hopeful because there is an energy like Darwin is talking about, and we are going to move it forward.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to all of our guests here today. I mean, I can feel the energy, and I just look forward to seeing the ways that you all and all of the advocates that you're working with will continue pushing for freedom in Louisiana and just across this nation. Thank you to our audience for being with us today, and we will be back tomorrow with another episode